talk about two things. I don't want to start talking about mobile stuff because that's sort of a new topic, and I don't want to do that right before spring break. So what I will do instead is we'll talk about, finish up talking about CSS stuff, and then talk about browser compatibility, all right? And how you approach that, and how do you test that, and so on, because it's a tricky topic. All right, so let's bring down what we had last time to review for a minute, and then we will make our last version of the prototype. I got to remember to do this next semester, so you guys lucked out. But I got to remember next semester to say that the prototype you should style twice. If you really want to make me happy, you'll create two versions of your prototype, one with a different style sheet. Even if it's just something small, you know, where you can do great changes with it, but I would just love that so much. I might not even look at the rest of the design. No, I'm just kidding. So we were talking about CSS and floating. So this is what we ended up with. So we have a little bit more to go on this. Here's what the page looked like, and here's what the code looked like. And remember, I put the CSS in the same file just for convenience sake, so I could easily lecture about both of them at the same time. It's not that it's a good idea. The best idea is to have the CSS in an external file so you can share it among multiple pages. All right, here's what the page looks like. The way this behaves is as it gets smaller at a certain point, it drops down below. The way floating works is if I say, in this case, float left, it tries to push it as far as the left as it can go, and it will try to put this guy alongside the thing to its left, so it will push it to the left, as long as there's space to include it and to include it completely within the window. So if there isn't, at a certain point, it'll drop down below, and you'll have two columns. We talked about like why this is particularly a sort of a good thing to do, and it gets back to the fact that we don't know what our page is going to be viewed on. We don't know if our page is going to be viewed on a gigantic monitor, you know, that has all kinds of space on it, or if our page is going to be viewed on a phone, or someone that has a small window set for their browser, or whatever. So in this case, the page sort of takes the shape of the container that is the browser window. So if we look at the code that did this, we have two sections, and they both are essentially the same thing, and they both float to the left. And we can sort of do some calculations to figure out at what point they'll break and they'll be underneath each other. Remember, the padding, the border, the margin, and all that comes into play along with the width. In this case, I express the width as a percentage. So you can say the width is a certain percentage, or you can say the width is a certain number of pixels. If you use a percentage, a lot of times you'll use a minimum width along with it. So you'll make it take up a percentage of the page, but you won't let it get any smaller than a certain size. Because if you don't have that minimum width at all, you'll literally get very, 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 very narrow columns. Maybe that's okay, I don't know. But a lot of times you want to keep the columns to be at least a certain minimum width. going to put, I have two sections and they're each 50%. And I'm going to tell you that these will never be alongside of each other. Now you might think that that doesn't make sense, right? If they're each 50%, they'll each take up half of a page, half of the width of the page. So why won't they ever be alongside of each other? Why won't they fit? They won't fit because the padding, the border, the margin gets added into it as well. So it's not just the width of it is 50%, but then when you add the other stuff, it's going to make it more than 50%. And therefore, it will never fit alongside of each other, no matter how wide the window is. Because this, from here to here, is 50% of the width. When you add the little bit of padding, the little bit of border, and a little bit of margin to it, that makes each one of these take up really a little bit more than 50%. So they can't possibly sit alongside of each other. That's really important to understand. All right, that if you want things to be set alongside of each other, you're not going to make it a full width of 50%. You might go 45% or 48% or something like that. So now if I do 45%, then they can't sit alongside of each other because the border padding and margin are small enough that it doesn't make a difference. All right, they can still fit alongside of each other. However, if I were to really crank up that border, if I were to make a 90 pixel border, oh, that's a 90 pixel margin. If I were to make a 90 pixel border, then they're not going to be able to fit alongside of each other again. All right. There's one more thing that I want to cover in this example before we move on to implementing this sort of design in our prototype. And that is, what if we have things that are not floated? All right. So, if I put a header section here, I'm not going to put any style rule for header to start. I'm not going to put any style for the header at first. All right. Well, that worked out pretty good. All right. That worked out pretty good because this is floated. These things got floated underneath it. What if I put a footer underneath it? I'm not going to put any style associated with the footer. Let's see if we can understand exactly why this works the way that it does. Put it over there. Pardon me? Okay. All right. It still won't matter, but that's a good observation. So if I make that a footer, it does the same thing. All right. Now, why does it do that? Well, it's like this. Remember something that I said way back a few classes back, that if we don't put any positioning about something in the style, it goes with the flow, right? Either you put something in the CSS that relates to the position, or the elements follow what's called the flow layout. And the flow layout is where they're one right after another. Well, that's what that did. That put that one right after another. And in this case, it put it alongside of it, it used up the available width, and there you go. So it's probably not what we want, though. You actually have a couple of choices with this on how to do this, how to handle this. One of them And I don't really prefer either of these two techniques. You can do either of them. One of the things you could do is you could just make sure that you float everything. So I'm going to say that the header has a width of 100% and float left. And I'll say the same thing for the footer. Well, now I've said something about the positioning, so it's going to follow my rules. All right. So the root of the problem is really that I've mixed letting me control some of the styles and letting the browser control the other styles. So we sort of clash between the way that we did it. If I control all the styles, then it'll probably work out the way that I want it to. All right, that's kind of what I would expect to want. Second thing you can do is you can say clear both. Clear both simply says stop the floating. Stop the floating. And let's start with a new flow, more or less. So this will do about the same thing. All right. So two things that you can do if you want part of your page to float and not all of it. You can make you can actually float all of it and just make the width 100%, or you can say clear both and then you start fresh underneath that. All right. So that's kind of what you can do with that. All right. On to making a version of our prototype that uses the floating methods. I usually, if I'm floating stuff on the page, I'm usually going to float everything. All right, just a way to put my own style control on it. I'm either going to do nothing and let the whole page be in the flow, or I'm going to style everything and give everything a property. We're actually going to look at a couple variations of this. All right. Let me start out with this one. I'm going to make a copy of this. No, I don't want that. The ones from last week. Put this one over here, and let's put CSS. All right. And I'm going to get rid of a lot of the, we're going to get rid of the widths and margins, and we're going to float, and we're going to see how it goes. Then we might add some of the margins back in. So the header, I want to have a width of 100%. And I want to float it to the left. All right. I'm going to get rid of the width and margin on all of these, and we'll build this a little bit at a time. So, that's up there. All right. Maybe I will make it a width of 80%. It doesn't go all the way across. All right. Now notice again how those other things follow the flow. So it kind of looks ugly right now. The navigation's right alongside of it. All right. So again, the reason for that is I've put something for the header, but I have removed everything as far as the nav goes. I'm going to put back in getting rid of the bullet points. All right, so now I'm going to float the navigation to the left as well. Again, now these two should be in proper position, but the rest of the stuff isn't. So I'm going to float the other two. That is the section and the footer. And then finally, I'm going to float the footer, because notice where the footer is, way up there, because it follows the flow because I have no style associated with it. All right, so there we have that. If we want to bump it a little bit over from the side, we can use, or from the top, we can use margins on all those things. So I can use I'm going to start putting the margins back in. So I'll say margin dash left, 50 pixels, margin dot top, 50 pixels. Got on the footer as well. And then I can do on the nav, I can say margin left, pixels, margin right, 20 pixels. I can play with the margins till I get that the way that I want it to. Maybe give each one, and maybe give those two a margin top of 10 pixels or something. Till I get exactly what I want. Put a little bit too much margin on the footer. So, all right. So yeah, maybe I'm happy with that. We did all that just by floating. All right. And the way this works is it'll go to a certain point. At a certain point, it'll drop down below it. If I was a little more careful with this, I would, this could possibly look a little better when that gets smaller than a certain point, if I gave like a minimum width on that. So let me try a minimum width on the nav of let's try 200 pixels, and I'll put a margin left on the section, so when it drops below, it still has that margin. All right. So now it looks even a little bit better when it gets smaller than a certain size. All right, so that's floating. All right. One thing to remember is we can use floating within things. So I'm going to make our final version of the prototype, and I'm going to add a second paragraph in the main section. So, no, I don't want that. I want to start with prototype 1 again. What if I had 2 paragraphs in the section as it stands now? If I put them in, because they're block tags, they're going to be on top of each other, right? Which is exactly what we would expect. But we can actually float those paragraphs within that section. So I can do something like this in the style sheet. I can say that any paragraph, any section, any paragraph within a section, I'm going to make the width 40%. Margin 5 pixels all the way around, and float left. on it. Dummy paragraph here, which I hate to do. I think this will work. I don't know why this is working, so ignore this part of the lecture. All right, but essentially you can do that. You can float within a section. I'm doing something wrong. I'm not sure what mistake I'm making. Nothing looks obvious, so we'll just forget that. Rewind. I guess it just goes to show that I'm human. So forget this part. All right. If I had like a full staff of video production engineers, I would go back and just edit that part out of the video. But yeah, maybe I'll make a blooper reel at the end of the semester, and we'll put that on there. All right, so I'll leave that in. Yeah, just ignore the error. All right, browser compatibility. All this works until we try to open this up in another browser, right? So let's take this. Let's take really any of our prototypes. Actually going to download this again. Oh, never mind, I have it already. All right, if I view this page in Microsoft Edge, it looks fine. I didn't expect that. Let's view it in Internet Explorer. It also looks fine. I didn't expect that. Let's try viewing these other prototypes in different browsers. All right, more or less looks fine. More or less looks fine. Looks fine. Looks fine. Just my luck, the day that I want to demonstrate problems with browsers, all our browsers are working properly and behaving properly. Isn't that how it goes? All right. The book talks about two things that you can do for old browsers. Keep in mind that this is a problem that becomes increasingly less important as time goes by and people stop using old browsers. There were big issues with Internet Explorer before version 9, I think.
You're right, yeah, it's 9.
Yeah, and Edge before some version. I don't remember specifically which version. And there were even issues with old versions of Firefox. There's a couple of things that and some of the problems related to HTML5. They talk about this in the book, but I'll do a brief talk about the salient points here. There's something called the Html5 Shim. And it's a workaround to enable styling of HTML5 elements in versions of old versions of Internet Explorer. In 2012, Internet Explorer had 30% of web browser usage around the world. So if you were using HTML5 in 2012, if you didn't do this, Internet Explorer didn't know, the version of Internet Explorer that was available at the time, didn't know how to handle HTML5 stuff. The reason for this is the people that are developing the new language, the HTML5 enhancement, and the people that are developing the browsers are working, but it's not like you developed a new language and then the world stops and the browser makers can develop a new version of it. All right? So things sort of go at the same time. So because of that, certain versions of Internet Explorer just didn't handle that. So what you did is you actually put this little snippet of code in your page. You actually put a little JavaScript file that you could download, or you could actually hot link to it like this, and you could use it, and it wouldn't make your web page HTML5 compatible, but it would handle basic styling for HTML5, so that HTML5 pages wouldn't look horrible. When I did this example like 2 years ago, and we had an earlier version of Internet Explorer here, when I pulled up those earlier versions of the prototype, it looked as though there was no style sheet on them, because that version of Internet Explorer didn't know what a header section was, or a footer, or a nav, because none of those things were part of HTML4. So we had to do something like this. And sure enough, if it's less than 9, then you do that. There's a similar thing for earlier versions of Firefox. They didn't call it the shiv, but it was like a shiv. And essentially what you did, IE doesn't believe in HTML5 elements. Again, before a certain version of that, it doesn't even see them. So the fix was this HTML5 shiv. All right, which we're showing here. In Firefox, or old versions of that, you could either save it, you could either have a JavaScript solution, or essentially all you did is you created a style sheet that told Firefox that those elements were block elements. So it was really a one-liner. You would have something that looked like this. You would say header, footer, nav, section, article, aside, display, block. You just include that in your style sheet, or create a separate style sheet that had that in it and include that as well. It's kind of hard to visualize, but if you did that, it would fix things. The bigger point isn't with HTML5, it's with cross-browser support. When you develop a web page, you have no idea what the person's going to be viewing it on. That's one of the toughest aspects of web design, is it's not a very controlled environment. People could be using the newest beta version of a browser that has bugs in it. Or they could be using an ancient version of the browser that, the Netscape browser from 1998 or something. You just don't know what people are going to be using. All right? And your job is to make your page as good as possible in all those environments. Now, that's the goal. All right? How do you ensure that goal? Well, you test on as many browsers as possible. If possible, you even test on earlier versions of the browser. Now, some places have great usability labs, like some software development companies and consulting companies have usability labs where they will have old machines with old versions of browsers that you can test it on, your code on. At least minimally for your class, view your page in a couple different browsers and make sure that it works. What's the fix if there's a problem? Depends on the problem. All bets are off. You can write code that works perfectly fine, all right, but the browser has a bug in it, and it doesn't interpret it correctly, and therefore it displays it differently than what you'd expect. Remember, your goal isn't to make your page look perfect in all these environments. Your goal is to make your page workable in all these environments. One thing that you can do to sort of ensure that you've done the best you can is make sure that you have valid HTML. But even that doesn't guarantee it. Because remember, we talked about this earlier in the class. What happens if you break the rules of HTML? It depends. Sometimes it will work just fine. Sometimes it won't. Well, the sad truth is sometimes even if you follow the rules of HTML, the browser has a problem with it. So every situation is sort of unique in itself, but it will all start off with testing your page on different browsers and different versions of browsers. When I do web pages, usually what I do is I'll contact my friends and say, look at this page. And the thought is that I hope anyhow, that each of them have enough differences in their browsers that I can test it out. There is a utility from W3C.org, the organization that defines HTML languages, called the Validator. That's sort of a spell check or grammar check for your web page. So I'm going to put my page in here and check it. And look at this. It checked it and there was no errors or warnings. That's the equivalent of a paper for your English class with no spelling or grammatical errors. Doesn't mean my web page is good, right? You can write a complete nonsense paper that everything's spelled right and the grammar's good, all right? But this will help ensure that it will work, but it won't completely guarantee that it will work. So a good practice to do is go and validate your web pages to make sure that it follows the rules. You can do the same thing with the CSS. This is especially useful if you're debugging the CSS. Like if you're not sure why your CSS is not working, you can copy it, or select all. Oh, there it was. No errors found. Congratulations. The errors that it gives you are kind of cryptic. Doesn't always make sense. Let's say, for example, a classic one is to spell background without the G, background, because that's kind of how people pronounce it. If you check it, it'll tell you that it found an error. And it'll tell you that background doesn't exist. That's actually a pretty clearly stated error. Sometimes the errors are a little less obvious than that, and it takes a little bit of skill to learn how to read them. But your first bet is to validate your code. Run your code through the validator. It will help find errors in your code. For example, let me paste this in, and let me deliberately mess something up. Let's say I forget the D in head. I run check. It doesn't tell me that I misspelled head. It says there's a stray end tag. There's an end tag for HEA that's stray, meaning that it doesn't have a partner for the starting tag. Well, a little bit of thought will tell you, oh, okay, that's supposed to be head, and then that will match up with that. So it takes a little bit of skill to learn how to read these errors. So the bottom line with browser compatibility, validate your code first. Test it on as many browsers as possible. If really old browser support is important, like you know something about your users, that many of them use an old browser or something like that, you can always go and download the Html5 Shim and put in that Firefox fix to fix for that. Fortunately, that's a problem that will at least partly go away, but I don't expect the bigger issue of browser compatibility errors, just the way that browsers are developed and the way that languages are developed, I don't expect that to ever go away. So it's going to be important no matter what, even if you've done things perfectly, to test on as many browsers and as many versions of browsers as you can to make sure that your code works. All right, that's all I had for today. I'll go unlock the lab for you, and then I'll come back to grab my files. When we come back, we'll start talking about mobile stuff. Yes?
I was wondering, could you show that portfolio, how do you get back to the portfolio? Because I'm trying things and I can't get back to the portfolio.
You have a folder for each of the lab assignments?
Right. And then I put in a link assignment and I said portfolio / portfolio HTML.
Okay, and that you wouldn't probably put portfolio / portfolio, because I would imagine that's a directory above it.
Yeah.
You'd use .. /.
Oh.
So portfolio, if you put the name of a folder, it always assumes you're going down a level in the directory structure. To go up, you simply use the ..
Great.
All right, so try that. If that doesn't work, then we can take a look at that.